I think a lot will depend on how quickly Ukraine can get production up and running. These Storm Shadow, Scalp, long-range cruise missiles, they've been very, very effective. The UK was the first to give Ukraine long-range missiles. That's why the UK is viewed very favorably here. And these missiles they're very stealthy. They're very they can penetrate areas of Russia which Ukraine's domestic munitions can't.
Andy Burnham has compared Ukraine's war with Russia with Britain's fight against the Nazis on his first official visit to the country since he became Prime Minister. He is also set to share the blueprints for long-range missiles which could strike much closer to Moscow. Meanwhile, the Kremlin has accused the UK of adding fuel to the fire and plotting to prevent a peaceful settlement process. Well, Jimmy Rushton is special correspondent at the Kyiv Independent and joins us now. Hello, Jimmy.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, thanks for being with us. Look, this is the first international visit that Andy Burnham has made as Prime Minister. What's the message he wants to send by making it to Ukraine, do you think?
I think it's very symbolic. I think for him, Britain has been very much at the forefront of support for Ukraine, and he wants to show that we're going to continue to be at the forefront of support for Ukraine under his premiership.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Look, Andy Burnham, he says this is the moment to keep up the pressure on Russia. We've seen Ukraine stepping up long-range attacks on Russia recently. Can it continue to do so? And what do you see as being the strategy behind that?
So, yeah, the long-range strike campaign that they've been waging against oil refineries and then these logistics centers by Wildberries, which is the Russian version of Amazon, they've been extremely effective, and they've been carried out using domestically produced Ukrainian drones almost exclusively. So these campaigns are sustainable, and the idea behind these campaigns is to increase the damage that Ukraine can do on the Russian economy and to really bring the war home to Russians. And we have obviously seen very, very long queues across Russia as fuel supplies have begun to dwindle. And you've seen many small businesses that were using Wildberries, this logistics center, to stock their products, going out of business. And that's had a knock-on effect for Russian consumers.
And is there any sense that this is, I mean, not that we can, it's very hard to get a sense of attitudes in Russia towards the war, but is there any sense that this is having an impact?
So I spoke to an expert on Russian attitudes, and they said that unfortunately it's not going to get the Russian population to rise up against the Kremlin and protest the war. But there is a sense of sullen resentment towards the Kremlin. And also, unfortunately, some Russians believe that it's the fault of the Russian government for not being too harsh on the Ukrainians and for not really prosecuting the war to the full degree that the Russians could. I mean, they are, to be honest. Russia is doing everything they can to subjugate Ukraine. And the claim that this adds fuel to the fire is kind of ridiculous, considering that Kyiv is routinely targeted by North Korean ballistic missiles at this point, Russia importing them, by the hundreds now.
Yeah, sure. So look, Burnham also announced that the UK is going to share information to allow Ukraine to make the British components of long-range missiles. Is that a tokenistic thing, or is that likely to make a real difference?
I think it's difficult to know. I think a lot will depend on how quickly Ukraine can get production up and running. These Storm Shadow, Scalp, long-range cruise missiles, they've been very, very effective. The UK was the first to give Ukraine long-range missiles. That's why the UK is viewed very favorably here. And these missiles they're very stealthy. They're very they can penetrate areas of Russia which Ukraine's domestic munitions can't, that Ukraine's drones and their slightly less sophisticated cruise missiles can't. So they are very, very valuable, and the Ukrainians prize them. So if they can get these production lines up and running relatively quickly, I think it will have an impact. But that will be the key measure of what impact they have, is how quickly they can get these production lines up and running.
So Moscow is increasingly irate about Britain's involvement in the war, with the Kremlin has said that the UK is participating in this war. Is this just typical Kremlin rhetoric, or do we feel like we're in slightly new territory here?
No, this is nothing new. The Russians have been saying this sort of thing since 2022. At every phase of increased Western aid to Ukraine, they made these very, very bellicose threats. And then generally when the aid is actually provided in the end, we saw this with F-16s, we saw it with HIMARS and a bunch of other capabilities. The Russians will say, well, it will make no difference anyway, or we'll destroy them all. And, we don't actually need to retaliate because this capability is meaningless. So it's nothing new. And if to the listeners, I would say, really don't be intimidated by Russian threats, because they are, we hear them every day in Kyiv, and we've heard them since 2022 in the UK as well.
Thank you very much indeed. That is Jimmy Rushton of the Kyiv Independent. Always good to speak to you, Jimmy.
Elsewhere tonight, Britain has agreed to give Ukraine classified blueprints for long-range missiles that can strike deep into and behind enemy lines ahead of Andy Burnham's first visit to the country since becoming Prime Minister. Andy Burnham's going to travel to Ukraine for the first time this week. Keir Giles is an Associate Fellow in the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House's think tank. Keir, so developing story this. We're just getting this news now. But what sort of shall I give you the context here, because we're talking about a green light for the defence firm the MBDA to share classified information on UK components for the French long-range missile Scalp. That's the equivalent of the Britain's Storm Shadow cruise missiles. What does that do for Ukraine in real terms, Keir?
Well, that's all correct. And of course, this follows an agreement with the French that Ukraine could actually build this under license, but it's a French-British co-produced missile. And in that respect, the British cooperation is essential. So what we're seeing described now is the finishing pieces, the last parts that Ukrainians need in order to build these missiles themselves, rather than have them supplied by France or the UK.
Right. And Russia have threatened Britain for supplying deep strike drones. Should we see this as a sort of sign of Britain's bullishness in the face of that threat?
I should certainly hope so, because after all, Russia threatens Britain for everything. But meanwhile, Russia itself is escalating its campaign against Europe and doesn't seem to be receiving any threats in return. Now, what we would hope is that this is part of a deterrence conversation in exactly the same way as it was back in 2023, when it was Ben Wallace, then Defence Minister, who authorised the first release of Storm Shadow missiles to Ukraine to use against Russia, after very specifically saying to Russia that this would be a consequence of their own actions. So yes, perhaps it is part of that conversation, but more importantly, it gives Ukraine the ability to strike deep into Russia against harder targets than it has done up until now, using weapons that it will be producing itself.
Give Andy Burnham some advice, Keir. He's going to be travelling to Ukraine this week. Send him off on his way with some advice. Go on.
He's saying all the right things. He's saying, of course, that Ukraine is our frontline as much as it is for the Ukrainians. He's saying that the UK will stand fast in support. But, of course, there's a big gap sometimes between saying and doing. And a lot of that bears less conviction if you don't see the United Kingdom investing in its own defence. Because, after all, one of the reasons why it is so important to allow Ukraine to build these missiles is because so few of them are being built elsewhere. So where the UK was one of the very early countries to be a moving part in this coalition that was supplying Ukraine with weapons, but then very quickly emptied the cupboard and couldn't supply any more because there hasn't been the willingness in the UK itself to spend on defence, to backfill what was supplied, to overhaul the UK's own armed forces ready for what's coming if Russia attacks further. So doing all of that would be a demonstration that Andy Burnham actually means the words that his speechwriters have written for him.
He heads into this with Zelenskyy a little bit weakened at the moment. He's under siege, really, from within, and he's had a credible challenge from a former defence minister in the last week or so. Do you think the United Kingdom will be, clearly not directly, but indirectly, supportive of Zelenskyy? Do we want Zelenskyy to endure?
I'm sure that they will be supportive of Zelenskyy, and it's not as clear-cut a picture as that when you look at it from inside Ukraine itself. Yes, there was a challenge from the former dismissed defense minister, but it hasn't gained the kind of popular support that's sometimes being portrayed outside the country. Right. Because there is solidarity within Ukraine. There is a recognition that this is not the time for political infighting and political games, and there's a widespread supposition that Fyodorov, the former defense minister, has actually overplayed his hand and overestimated his support and how much he could be disruptive within that political system in a nation that's fighting a war for its own existence.
OK, Keir, good to talk to you as ever. Thank you so much for your insight. Keir Giles, who's an Associate Fellow at the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House, with us on Times Radio.